Well, we'd like to welcome everyone to a new edition of Food Bites, and the tables are a little turned. I'm Jane Roy, and we've got another Jane Roy here on Zoom. So, actually, we've got my husband, Glen Pearson, which is pretty amazing. Glen, how are you feeling actually being interviewed and not doing the interview?
I'm okay being interviewed, just not by you. That hasn't happened before, so it could prove interesting.
Yeah. So we did this last week. It's after the food drive right now. And the tables were turned and you were interviewing me. And the focus there was a lot more with regards to the food bank, with regards to individual food security and what families kind of go through. We talked about how this week we wanted to talk about community food security, a little bit different. Let's just start there. What does that actually mean? What does that mean to you? So, when somebody says food security as opposed to food insecurity, what do you mean by that?
Well, let me start off by saying this will air later on this week, and the food drive will officially be over. But the way that it has gone, it's been fantastic. The people gave so much in the course of this last 10 days. It's just been amazing. And the two thrusts of this food drive were last week when I interviewed you, it was to thank people, to just say thank you. We didn't set targets or anything for them. And then this week, you're right, it's talking about food security. But I think it's important that people understand that for all that's happened in this last week, and as wonderful as it has been, that is not food security. These are emergency measures that a community will often do, not just the food bank, but other groups, to try to help people in food insecurity. So, we don't want a future to be that it's all donation based. We want a future to be so that every family in London, not just people of low income or people on disability or Ontario Works or whatever, but that all of these people have open and easy access to local food, good food, fresh food, and affordable food. And that's really what food security is. Food security is food for everybody, not just the hungry, but it's sustainable food. It's done in ways in which everybody can get it and that it's affordable for everybody. And we don't often talk about that much. Usually when we come up with food security, it's like talking about homelessness, but you don't talk about homes.
Yeah.
Same thing is true here. You can go ahead and talk, food security all you want, but if you don't have the food, it's just not going to work. So we have to find ways to make that food available. That's what I mean by food security.
You've oftentimes used the ambulance and used the healthcare system as a good example of this, right? The food bank is like the ambulance that goes around. It's an emergency thing, but there's a real need for obviously a place like hospitals, but even the prevention, the whole idea of people not going there. So you're talking about the health of the whole community, correct?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's where it stands. I think we understand that about kids. We know when kids go to school, you can go ahead and give them a breakfast program if they're not being fed well at home or whatever. But for people, then they're not so much thinking of food security, they're thinking of health. If the child or the student is not getting the food that they need, then they can't advance the way that they need to as well, not just in learning, but also in physical development. So I think that's really what food security is about, right? It's not these emergency things like ambulances running around trying to take somebody from A to B. It really is about people not needing ambulances or not needing hospitals that are able to find health within themselves, other than emergencies, which we know that happen. So I am worried that food banks, which are basically ambulances, they're basically helping people in a difficult situation to try to get over that period. They're not hospitals. And I'm afraid that more and more what's happening is that people are depending on food banks and making them kind of permanent when that was never the idea.
Yeah. So at the beginning, there's a couple things that you mentioned, Food Policy Council being one, the food assessment coming up. The London Middlesex Food Policy Council is actually under the auspices of the London Food Bank. It was started by the London Community Foundation, the Middlesex London Health Unit, the City of London, the food bank kind of coming together. And it's based, and its idea is more what you're talking about is providing food security for all, kind of the whole, not just field to forks, but even sort of the wayside, that there's a whole food cycle. Can you talk a little bit more about how important those two things in particular are?
I think, one of the things that you have when you bring up food security, one of the real difficulties is who's in charge of that? Right? Is it the food bank? Absolutely not. That's not our job. But we have known how important it is, so therefore we funded and we've been involved in these things from the beginning. And that's why we're still the financial managers trying to help financially through with the Food Policy Council. But I think the way that we all, and you were there at the start, Jane, you were the one that really helped to get that going. I think at the very beginning, it was this understanding. It wasn't about food insecurity. It was about food security. What do you do with all this food that's around London, but not necessarily getting into it? So the idea of these larger groups coming together, I mean, the foundation helped to fund most of it, the London Community Foundation, and that was great. But the city was involved, the health unit was involved, once again, linking that thing about food and health. And then the food bank was really there. I mean, we were really helping to drive that whole process. But I think the Food Policy Council was really the group that we looked at to kind of steer this from this point forward. It was not going to be City Hall. It wasn't going to be the health unit. It wasn't going to be the food bank either. It was really going to be this Food Policy Council. So it took months and months and months of meetings, and you were there for all of those. But it also involved the farmers out in Middlesex, right? Involved all of these different groups. And the idea was that if we could just get it started, then that would be the group that could drive food security. And it happened. I mean, after lots of struggle in making it happen, it did. And then we had to figure out, well, what do they have to say? What is it that they're going to tell the community? And that's where the idea came up of the food assessment. Now, I showed a copy of that food assessment a couple of weeks ago, and it's about this thick, right? It's massive. It cost tens of thousands of dollars to get it done. We got this group with real expertise from Toronto to come down and help us over the course of months. And that, I would have to say that document to me was almost as important as a constitution or a Bill of Rights. It had so much in it to help to guide us forward. But one of the things, and it got finished and it got completed, and we had a press conference down at the market, and all the key players were there, and we all celebrated that we had this. I remember the city saying, we never had this kind of information before, but now we know how to do policy because we've got it. But 2 weeks ago when I did the video, I said nobody can find it. That was a number of years ago, and we never built on it. We never used it. The only place you could find it was on the website of the Middlesex London Health Unit, where it is at today. It's a remarkable document, and we never used it. And now it's years old. So there's a whole bunch of new developments that have happened in these last 6-7 years since it came out. So fortunately, they were able to get some funding from the city, another component of funding for them, for the Food Policy Council to update that assessment. And that's in the process of happening now, and hopefully be done in the next 2 months. But those two things just by themselves, you develop an assessment. It's kind of like
Baseline. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a baseline. And now we know what we're up against. If we're talking food security, how much gets thrown out? How much of it is wasted? How much of it is buried back in the ground? How much of it is accessed? How much of it is nutritious? How much of it is local? How is it stored? How is it distributed? How is it sold? Where is it sold? All of those kind of things were all in that. And it's a wonderful, wonderful document. But in order for that to work, you really need to have an agency that will take that and build their future on it. Mm-hmm. And that's what the Food Policy Council is supposed to be. And I think what's really bothered me and you, and probably some others as well, is it's not being resourced the way that it needs to be. It struggles to find funding. People meet, you're there at all the meetings, Jane. People are really working hard within the Food Policy Council to find traction within the London community to say, think about food as a way of life. Think about London as a food city. How would that look, and where would we get the resources? That's what they're trying to say. That's what they're trying to do. But they're having real trouble getting traction, and they're really having trouble getting funding.
Yeah. I think going through the pandemic, we used to meet with all the different EDs, and we talked about challenges that we went through, but there was a number of EDs that were part of it, that were part of the food system. Remember, for instance, Andrew Philippe from Growing Chefs. He talked about how because he wasn't a direct service or a social agency that was dealing with basic needs, he felt it was his job to actually pull back.
Yeah.
And so it was a very, very difficult time. That his job was actually more about, sort of the education piece. And obviously at that time, what was really needed was places like food banks not to close. It was places like the Salvation Army, the social services, where people really needed to go. And it was a time for groups like us. But you're basically more and more talking about it's more and more becoming a time for those groups that actually, have policy or education or some of those kind of things in as well. Correct? Or how
Yes.
do you feel about that?
Well, I think like Andrew, and we've interviewed Andrew on Food Bites here, and he has said that same thing then. He does not want to be seen as this kind of emergency group. To him, it is about food security. It's about teaching kids in schools about how to grow food, how to cook it, access it, all of those kind of things. I think we as food banks, we kind of try to do what Andrew has done. Andrew said, I'm not going to be a permanent emergency supply group. That's not what I'm here for. And food banks has said that from the very beginning. Jane, you and I remember when the food banks of Canada all came here to London and helped to get a start at the University of Western Ontario. That was back in 1987 or 88. We remember when the first food banks came, and they came to London, and we helped to start the Ontario Association of Food Banks. But that also included a food bank for Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
That this was so early on in the day back in 1986 that food banks were trying to figure out what is our role in society. And they determined that their role was actually a temporary one, that we were in the middle of a recession, and this recession seemed to be elongating, and there was more and more troubles happening as a result economically in the country. So we decided that it would be better for us to organize in a way that we could efficiently deliver systems, do policy, do research, right, but also collaborate back and forth with food, that we could do that, and then, hopefully at that point, then we peel off. It never happened. Of course, that after that recession was over, the poverty numbers stayed very, very high. And I think at that point, when they were meeting here in London, they were talking about sunset clauses. Do you remember that? I mean, it's a long time ago. That's 36 years ago. We're old, Jane. And they were talking about in order to challenge government to say, instead of depending on us, you guys have to, build up the social protection programs that are part of our constitutions and bills of rights, so on and so forth. You have to do that. And if you're not going to do that, you're not going to have us. We'll have signed sunset clauses and we'll close in 3 or 4 years. And then it's all back to you as a government. And you're not going to have to deal with all of these thousands of people. And in the end, we couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't, the government did not come forward. And were any of us going to abandon those people in their need? There was just no way. So I do think my view of what's been going on here is that I think 10 years ago, groups like the Food Bank Community Foundation and others, before the economy got really bad, I think we all thought, you know what, let's combine together and let's build food security. So this isn't an emergency thing. This is like a system where people can get food anywhere, local, well priced. And so that's what we decided to do. And I think what you and I have been trying to do in this food drive, I don't know the right way to say it, but is to bring the band back together. We lost the food assessment. We're not quite sure where it is. There were others, another great report that was done by the Western Fair. They paid some good money to do it, about how all the food around London was bypassing London and going to the terminal, and we never had access to it. And that paper, called the White Paper, it interviewed farmers and others in the area who said, that's not what we want. We want to bring our food into London. We're parts of community. This is what we're at. Many of them worked with groups like Libro, for instance, which is a country credit union to help to get money to help their operations to run. And Libro was also trying to move them that way to think about London. It just didn't happen. So I think what we're trying to say, it's a long way to answer your question, but I think what we're trying to say, and we were emphasizing in the food bank for the food drive, is that you're not going to get anywhere by talking about a food assessment. We have to build on it. You're not going to get anywhere by having a food policy council limp along. You're not going to get anywhere if you're going to allow your farmers, right, to not be able to sell their food here in London the way that they wish to. So we have to do a better job of that. And I think that in order for that to happen, I think those original groups need to come together. The city is part of that as well. And then we need to really talk about how will we build on that for the future.
Well, Interesting that you're talking about sunset clause, and I'm actually going to point out, have a look at yourself in the Zoom, Glenn.
Yeah.
You see the sun coming across
Yeah,
in
straight.
stripes.
Yeah, yeah, I do. Well, this is early Sunday morning when we're recording this, Jane, right? You and I hang up this, and then we go off to church for the Easter Sunday service. But yeah, that's right. But we really believed it back then. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, for sure.
folks knew they really believed that the systems worked, and but the first one started in Edmonton in 1981. It really got fleshed out in 1984, a constitution and everything. But it was a response to an economic emergency that nobody had quite seen before.
Yeah.
And how many recessions have you and I had since? Three, four, plus what we're going through now. And every time that poverty went up during a recession, the recession ended, it plateaued, but it never went down. Then it went up again during the next recession. Same thing happened. And now with COVID being over, largely in recession, we're now in the same problem. We were hoping things would go back to normal, and they didn't. Our numbers are going up by 50%. We're seeing numbers we've never seen before, setting records every month. That's true for food banks across the country. You cannot build a health system on ambulances, and you can't build food security on food banks. Not the way.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely still needed. You still need, as
Yeah.
people go through the cycles of life. But I think you're right. We've become kind of the de facto way of dealing with it, for sure. And
Yeah.
there needs to be more and more emphasis on some of these other things.
And part of
Um,
the problem with that, just to interrupt you there, is that the system depends on the donor,
yeah,
right? And so in the past, that always kind of worked. Londoners have been so generous in the city. You and I know that. We've hardly ever had to set targets. They're just always right there. They're so generous. That includes business cares and organizations and others. But at the same time, I think it's really important that we have to acknowledge that in this particular occasion, since COVID has kind of pulled back somewhat, Londoners, average Londoners who are normal donors, are having to pay way more for rent, way more for food. And the report just came out on the weekend that it's going to go up another 5 or 6% about food. This is the time we're wanting it all to come down. It's not going to happen. So you're actually depending on a donor base that themselves are really under challenge. And so I don't think this is just about helping people who are food insecure. It's about the average citizen who's trying to do their best, or the average company, or the average organization or faith group or whatever, who are trying to do their level best to keep that going. But as those numbers magnify and get huge, there will come a point when that system is no longer sustainable. So for the sake of the donor, we also need to work on food security. Food security is really important so that the donor themselves gets some relief.
yeah. I do think, one of a couple other tenets that or core things that we really believe in is that a place like the Lynn Food Bank was also about the average citizen to participate. So
Yeah.
whether that was volunteer or donating, I think that still is core and still is key. But one of the other things, which actually is kind of on the food security side, was actually with a couple different things. Food waste. When you look at a whole food secure system, the fact is we produce a lot of food and it gets thrown out.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments, or I know you're usually a wealth of stats on those kind of things.
Well, I think I think the thing that matters is that the public actually doesn't want that, and yet they participate in it.
Yeah.
I think that we continually throw out food that we shouldn't be. We continually overbuy, and grocery stores depend on us doing that. And so you come up with things like the food assessment really pointed this stuff out, and that's why it should be the way that we move forward. But when I think of what the food bank has done with the grocery stores and with the help of business cares to get tons and tons and tons of food every year diverted from the landfill and coming here coming to the food bank in order to be distributed to hungry families, it's a great model. It's fantastic, but it's based upon waste. Right. And I think that that's really important. That food would be better if it could be sold, right? Or if it could bring down the price of food so that people who are food insecure can actually afford the food in the grocery stores. But how can you do that when middle class people themselves are having trouble affording food in grocery stores right now? So I do think things like food waste, all of those things are really important, and you do them. But the fact that there is so much waste means that we have a system that's not running right. If we apply that system to anything else that we have in our lives, we would know that the outcomes from that would not be healthy. So to have so much waste in the system is exactly the same. If you end up in an economy where everybody just buys stuff, but they don't have enough money to send their kid to university, right? Or they don't have enough money to provide food for their family, would say a part of that problem is waste. We're spending inappropriately. And as a society, that's what we're doing. So waste itself is like a canary in the coal mine, just like food banks are. There's a problem within the system. So you're doing something now to alleviate it, much like having a food bank to help hunger. But the ultimate problem is at the source. Why are we wasting so much?
Right. And part of that waste is things like transportation, or actually in the farmers field, the farmers in terms of just the amount of product that they produce, whether it's going to the terminal and then coming back, whether it's a lot of different things. But one of the great things about being together and married is we often get up and at 6:30 in the morning, we're having tea and we're discussing, we're talking about things. One of the that you've actually, I think it was this morning or yesterday, talked about some stats which were just kind of astounding with regards to farmland and others. Can you expound on a little bit?
I thank Steve Bolton from Libro for giving me this stuff. He's now retired from Libro and is dearly missed everywhere. But I think Steve told me that part of their study they did for Southwestern Ontario is that Southwestern Ontario is 4% of the farmland in Canada. That's all. But it produces 26% of Canada's food.
Mm,
That's
wow.
amazing. Now, we would all say, well, that makes sense because we've always been told that Southwest Ontario is the best farmland in the world.
Yeah.
Okay, that's probably true, and it's definitely being used and it's growing food and everything else. But for our populations, it's not really part of their food security system. It's really part of a globalization system, which is necessary. I'm not trying to speak against that, but it ends up being that you've got tons and tons of food going away when the people themselves are having trouble affording it or accessing it. Jane, you and I have seen this in Sudan, where China has opened up vast tracts of farmland in South Sudan, which is the watershed of the Nile. So, I mean, there can be great farmland there. But those people in South Sudan watch that food get harvested by Chinese workers and then go to a port or go to a place like Mombasa or an airport or whatever, and then they all go back to China. And the people whose land it is, and the people who really need the food, I mean, we all know just how poor it is there, watch these things go by in trucks and cannot access it. I think that's part of what southwestern Ontario is facing. Talk to the food bank in Windsor. Talk to the food bank in Sarnia, in Chatham. We've got a friend in Chatham running the one there. I mean, look at Kitchener. Just go ahead, look at southwestern Ontario. These food banks are all reaching a maximum point of people who can't afford food. And yet, so much of our food, so much great, great, great food is bypassing them every day. There's something wrong with that system.
Mhm. Or it bypasses and then comes back in terms of, just the farmland and what the farmers are doing. I mean, that whole transportation thing is
Yeah.
difficult as well.
And by the time it gets back to us, it's a huge environmental waste, but also the costs really go up because it ended up taking 2 or 3 steps that did not need to happen. I'm not saying that the globalization of food or things don't need to happen. They definitely don't need to happen in a way that creates so much environmental damage. I think that's very important. But I also think that a bunch of that food, huge chunks of it, could be accessed locally without ever having to go anywhere. But for some reason, communities, citizens themselves, even organizations and civic governments are content to just depend on a grocery kind of system that sees food tracking all over the place. And then they pay more for each of those different steps rather than just realize if we had twice as many markets here in London, right? It would be great if farmers had auctions that they could do here down at places like the Western Fair or anywhere where there's room like other communities do. We could become a food city, and then suddenly that food becomes affordable. Right now, if you get local food, it sometimes is more expensive than the stuff you get from Chile or from Brazil, right? But if you're starting to then put that food into the system and more of it is available, the cost of that food comes down and it becomes affordable.
Yeah. I was going to ask about that because there has been a rise of farmers markets and pop-up markets all across the city, which has been great. But for somebody with income insecurity, it actually becomes really difficult because you have your funds are less and you get less food. Now it's healthier and it's all of those different things, but it actually is cheaper to go to a grocery store and get a bag of apples or get some ugly fruit or whatever it is. So you're saying that the more of that happens, that actually the costs actually decrease for everybody else. And it's also accessible in the sense of it, particularly if there's neighborhood farmers markets that pop up.
So it really helps three groups, I think. It really does help the people in low income because it now makes food within their reach. They can get to those low branches and get the kind of food they normally couldn't afford before. For average citizens, it's finally giving them local food and it's driving down the price of that local food, right? So they're able just even environmentally to shop local, buy local. And then I think for the growers, it really allows them to bring their food into London, the place that they want to be. And that's especially true not of the big factory farms that are more interested in the globalization, but the smaller farms, the small to medium-sized farms that are kind of fading away in Ontario. Part of the reason why they're fading away is that there are not opportunities in local cities to put the food in there. They would rather do that than take it down to the terminal in Mississauga. So it helps all three of those groups. So you need to have a policy, and London to some degree does. Every city does. You need to have a policy that recognizes that. We have an assessment that proves it. We have a food policy council that can help us to implement it. But we don't. In fact, we can't even find a founding document. That shows you just how far we have to go.
Yeah, I do know that when citizens use the power of their buying, kind of the buying collective, that's obviously when a lot of things change. I mean, we've got great relationships with most of the grocery store managers, and most of the grocery store managers talk about, exactly the same thing. They're trying to get fresh local produce in as well, because that's what their customers are wanting. So it is us that makes those changes.
That's right. We're in our final minute or two here, so I'm going to one more question you can ask me. Don't embarrass me. But anyway, that's all the time I got left. But what's one final thing we can talk about?
Well, I'm really sorry because I wanted to get to the greenhouse and growing and green walls and some of those kind of projects. But I guess, Glenn, we've been around for 37 years.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, we're going to hit 40 soon. Do you want to stay around for another 40?
I just want to, what's the right way to put it? I just want to burn out for community. I think you're the same. I don't think food banks are going anywhere soon, and I don't think food banks are the answer. But food banks point to the answer. When you see citizens mobilize the way that they've done for food banks across the country, it is an absolute phenomenon. It's a remarkable, remarkable thing. And I want to be part of the system where those citizens then turn around and fight for food security. Not just to fight for food banks and to help the needy and low-income families. I think they're doing what they can, and I think they're under huge economic burdens themselves right now. But I want to be part of a society. I want to see those citizens that we know and that we trust so much be given the opportunity to turn the system around so there's enough food for everybody in some of the best farmland in the world, and it's affordable. That is not impossible. It's been done elsewhere, and I want to be part of that. Right now, of course, I'll stay on the food bank as long as I can because I love it. It's just awesome. You're exactly the same, but it's not sustainable at these levels that the economy has put us at right now. So I really want to work with citizens and with institutions and bring the old band back together to sing this song again about food security. And I want to work with you above all to mobilize this community and say, okay, we've kept people afloat. Now it's time to help them succeed. And I really think food security will do that.
Well, it's been amazing working together. I mean, not only has it been a great ride, but you've made a real difference, Glenn, and we, along with so many other London citizens, have been involved. And I guess all I can say is, to the next, we won't be around 40 years from now, but that's wonderful. Let's to the next years of partnership. I really look forward to it.
Yeah, and don't ever, ever, ever question London's generosity. We as a food bank cannot permit that. We would not tolerate it in our building. That we are proof positive of how generous people are. Now we need to turn that generosity into social justice and food security. And I think we can have a role to play in that as a food bank. I've really enjoyed this. It's been good in spite of all the sun. And I would remind you that when we first started, Jane, I had hair. So that's a
Yeah.
lot. Thank you for
Thank you,
this, Jane.
Glenn.
Really
Let's go
enjoyed
have some tea. Thank you.
it. Okay, thanks. Bye bye.